Welcome to the moment NATO never saw coming, the night a Soviet radar looked into the future. Not a missile launch, not a spy plane, a pulse that made enemy aircraft disappear before they were even seen. 1983, Murmansk, USSR. Engines roared through the fog-drenched Arctic air, their heat carving streaks in the cold. Steel and silence held the coast except for the hum. A frequency so faint no one could hear it yet. Every NATO instrument could feel it. A pulse. A whisper in the static. Inside a bunker carved into permafrost, a Soviet technician lit a cigarette that never quite stayed lit. The smoke trembled each time the radar dish outside turned toward the sky. He didn't know he was staring into the birth of something NATO would later call the ghost net. This wasn't just another early warning system. It was a weapon of perception, a radar that didn't see planes but predicted them. It mapped their movement before they appeared. It read the air like a mirror reads light. When NATO analysts first picked up the anomaly, they thought it was noise. Then one by one, aircraft vanished from Western screens, still flying, still alive but unseen. Panic spread across listening stations from Tromsø to Scotland. Smoke in lungs, steel vibrating. A single order cuts through the Arctic static, track them blind. This is NATO never expected a Soviet radar that changed the war. Pause for a second. Where are you listening from? Imagine hearing that pulse through your own radio. What would you have thought it was? The story of the radar began long before the Arctic hum was heard. It started in the quiet years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union learned that the most dangerous weapon the West possessed was not its arsenal, but its ability to see first. Satellites crossed the skies without challenge. High-altitude planes photographed missile silos from the stratosphere. In the Kremlin's view, the Americans no longer aimed to destroy, they aimed to anticipate. And so the Soviet Union began searching for a way to look further, to feel the air before it was pierced. Among the scientists who believed this was possible stood Sergei Anatolyevich Morozov, a young radar physicist from Leningrad, whose fascination with invisible patterns bordered on obsession. He spent nights in laboratories tracing radio echoes that bounced along the ionosphere, convinced that space itself could be used as an instrument. During one polar experiment in the late 70s, he intercepted fragments of American naval chatter, reflected thousands of kilometers across the pole. It was accidental, fleeting, and distorted, but it changed everything. If we can hear them by accident, he told his superior, then we can see them by anticipation. At first, the generals laughed. Radar was supposed to respond to what existed, not what might exist. But in 1981, when NATO launched Exercise Able Archer, a rehearsal so lifelike that Moscow mistook it for an actual nuclear launch, no one was laughing. The entire Soviet defense network went to near alert. Commanders froze at the realization that by the time they confirmed an incoming strike, it would already be too late. That winter, a single line appeared in a restricted memo to the Ministry of Defense: authorize Project Veil. Objective pre-appearance detection. Funding came quietly drawn from the Strategic Rocket Forces research budget. Within a year, a facility rose from the tundra near Murmansk, disguised as a standard over-the-horizon radar. Beneath its frozen foundations stretched kilometers of copper wiring and vacuum tubes buried in permafrost. The official name was Outpost 27-9. To its engineers, it was simply the machine. Recruits were chosen for silence rather than loyalty. They were physicists, mathematicians, and cryptographers pulled from universities and stripped of their identities. No family contact, no records of transfer, just new uniforms with no insignia. Their daily life followed the rhythm of static and snow. Each morning began with calibration drills. Each night ended with the low heartbeat of the dish turning toward the North Sea. They learned to interpret noise like language, to read turbulence as intent. In time, they spoke of seeing ghosts, small ripples in the signal that seemed to predict the path of NATO aircraft minutes before they appeared on standard screens. The deeper the research went, the stranger it became. Morozov's equations implied that the atmosphere behaved like a mirror, with memory recording traces of movement and replaying them seconds ahead of time. The technicians began logging predictions, comparing them with real sightings from conventional radar. When patterns aligned, morale soared. When they didn't, entire shifts were replaced. Failure was never discussed, only erased. Inside the bunker, isolation turned scientific discipline into something close to ritual. Men whispered to machines, listening for harmonics others could not hear. Cigarette smoke curled beneath the red bulbs as they traced thin oscillations across phosphor screens. The air smelled of ozone and wet metal. Above them, the Arctic winds screamed, blending with the drone of generators. No one dared question whether they were still observing the enemy or creating him. By late 1982, data from Outpost 27-9 began reaching Moscow. What analysts saw astonished them. The system appeared to register aircraft launches from Britain seconds before NATO flight logs confirmed takeoff. The implications were terrifying. If true, it meant the Soviets could strike preemptively, guided not by sight, but by prediction. Yet verification proved nearly impossible. Some in the Politburo called it a miracle of Soviet genius. Others whispered it was a phantom born from cold and fear. NATO listening stations in Norway and Scotland soon noticed anomalies of their own bursts of signal energy without source or pattern. At first, they blamed weather or interference from trawler radios. But when multiple radar screens across Europe began flickering blank at once, panic spread. British analysts dubbed it the ghost net. American technicians described it as an echo with intent. No one could locate its origin. It moved like a living thing, shifting frequency each time they tried to trace it. Inside Outpost 27-9, Morozov and his team realized the scale of what they'd built. Their machine was no longer just reading the atmosphere. It was interacting with it, feeding minute distortions back into the layer it monitored. They had created a loop, a self-echoing field, that blurred the line between detection and interference. What NATO experienced as disappearance was to them confirmation of success. Each missing blip on Western screens was proof that their prediction net had closed. Yet victory came at a price. Continuous exposure to high-frequency bursts began affecting the operators. Headaches, tinnitus, and brief episodes of disorientation were common. Some claimed to hear voices through the static, a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat whispering in Morse. The KGB dismissed these as stress reactions. Morozov noted them meticulously in his journals, then stopped writing altogether. By 1983, when NATO finally identified the source of the interference near Murmansk, it was already too late. The radar had gone fully autonomous, adjusting its own frequencies beyond human oversight. For 12 minutes, NATO's northern early warning grid went completely dark. Aircraft vanished mid-flight. Pilots reported invisible turbulence like flying through glass. The incident was quietly buried in military archives labeled unconfirmed atmospheric anomaly. But those 12 minutes rewrote doctrine. In every NATO command room, the phrase began to circulate in hushed tones. They saw us before we appeared. That single sentence would haunt Western strategy for decades. The men of Outpost 27-9 never received medals. The project was dismantled months later, its components sealed beneath Arctic ice. Yet the legend endured: a radar that could see through time, a signal that changed the war without firing a shot. And from that frozen silence rose the phrase still whispered across declassified files today: NATO never expected it. The first months of Project Veil's activation were chaos disguised as progress. On paper, the new recruits were elite top graduates from Moscow, Kiev, and Novosibirsk. In practice, they were strangers trapped in a frozen labyrinth, working on a machine that punished mistakes faster than it rewarded success. The loss rate during initial calibration tests reached 22%, not in casualties, but in system integrity. Circuits burned out overnight, amplifiers froze, and antenna arrays cracked under their own resonance. Every malfunction became a lesson in survival, and every fix a ritual in patience. The officers supervising the outpost called it training through attrition. No manuals existed for this radar, only prototypes and instinct. Crews were divided into rotating 12-hour shifts, one team on the surface, two below ground, one in sleep rotation. The underground control room pulsed like a living organism, its walls lined with copper veins that radiated faint warmth. Operators learned to work by ear as much as by sight. The tone of the static, too sharp, too hollow, told them more than any reading on their analog screens. Their discipline was built not on slogans but silence. Conversations happened in glances, gestures, half-finished sentences. Each team was expected to know what the others needed before they asked. Morozov insisted that predictive instinct had to begin with the operators themselves. "You cannot build a machine that foresees," he said, "unless the men running it learn to anticipate." It took months to achieve that rhythm. The crew's trust was forged through failure. Every false alarm, every signal lost in atmospheric noise became a shared wound. One night, during a high-altitude calibration test, the radar's main dish seized mid-rotation. The bearings froze, locking the entire structure toward the Barents Sea. Outside, in temperatures below -32, technicians climbed the tower by hand, spraying antifreeze into the gearbox as wind cut through their uniforms. When the system restarted at dawn, they returned with faces frostbitten and fingers stiff, but the signal held steady for 12 straight hours. From that day, no one doubted the machine's worth. Fuel for the generators was flown in weekly by transport aircraft from Arkhangelsk. Each delivery brought 1 to 200 gallons of aviation-grade kerosene, enough to keep the array humming for 6 days under full load. Efficiency became obsession. Power spikes were trimmed by rerouting current through backup coils. Heat loss was measured in breaths per minute. One officer joked that the entire operation ran on cold static and cigarettes. He wasn't wrong. By the third phase of training, the crew had reduced signal drift by 8.6%, an achievement. Moscow deemed operational readiness level 1. It meant the radar could now maintain continuous lock on atmospheric distortions across a 400-kilometer radius without visual confirmation. In human terms, they had learned to see the invisible. Life inside the bunker changed with that milestone. The men grew quieter, more methodical. Fatigue was constant, but so was pride. They moved like parts of the same mechanism, a human algorithm designed to predict threats before they were real. No one celebrated birthdays, no one drank. Cigarettes and silence were their only luxury. Morozov rarely spoke above a whisper. He spent hours beside the main console, scribbling equations on transparent film taped to the monitors. His assistant, Lieutenant Yuri Plekhanov, handled morale. "You must understand," Plekhanov once told a visiting officer, "we are training men to think like machines. Every emotion must be tuned to the signal." Still, the signal fought back. At random intervals, the radar emitted resonance spikes, pulses strong enough to knock out lights across the compound. Instruments jumped, screens bled white. The engineers called it ghosting, an unavoidable artifact of operating near the upper resonance limit. When these bursts hit, operators were trained to step back, close their eyes, and count to 6, the exact duration before the field stabilized. More than once, the room smelled of burned hair and ozone after a burst. Yet no one was allowed to leave their post. The most demanding phase of preparation came during cross-peak training exercises meant to simulate real interception. NATO aircraft would fly reconnaissance missions along the Norwegian Sea, and the Soviet radar teams would attempt to predict their trajectories purely through atmospheric distortion. Over 46 attempts, the crew of Outpost 27-9 achieved an average predictive accuracy of 73%, an astonishing figure for a system that officially did not exist. Each success built belief. Each failure sharpened fear. One winter morning during exercise Delta 14, a predicted phantom approach aligned perfectly with radar blackout reports from NATO stations in Bodo and Aberdeen. When confirmation reached the outpost, the control room erupted, not with cheers, but with stunned silence. They had crossed the threshold between theory and power. The radar didn't just foresee, it erased. After that, training changed tone. Protocols became doctrine. Operators were no longer students, but guardians of a secret. Maintenance routines turned ritualistic: 3 rotations per day, recalibration every 6 hours, frequency sweeps logged to the second. Each shift leader signed a paper declaring system in resonance. Operator aligned. Sleep schedules were cut to 4 hours. Caffeine pills replaced rest. By mid-1983, Outpost 27-9 operated like a monastery more than a base. Orders came, encrypted voices were rare. Outside, the endless polar night erased the horizon. Inside, the hum of the radar was constant, almost human. Men said it breathed in rhythm with them. Some stopped hearing it at all, claiming it had moved inside their skulls. Despite the strain, the machine performed flawlessly. System uptime exceeded 99.2%, unmatched by any Soviet installation north of the Arctic Circle. The only things breaking faster than the electronics were the people. 3 technicians were evacuated for psychological fatigue, 2 for frostbite, 1 for auditory hallucinations under electromagnetic influence. Moscow labeled all incidents operational wear. By the end of the training phase, the radar and its crew were indistinguishable, one neural network of flesh and wire bound by repetition and silence. They had mastered the machine, or perhaps the machine had mastered them. Either way, Project Veil was ready to be unleashed. When the order came to switch the radar from passive to predictive mode, no one spoke. They simply watched as the indicator light turned from red to green, and the Arctic air began to sing. The hum was steady, confident, alive, like breath returning to a body that had never died. That morning, for the first time, NATO aircraft entering the Barents Sea vanished not by accident, but by design. And in the frozen bunker of Outpost 27-9, every man understood what they had become, not operators, not soldiers, but the first generation of human sensors in a war that could no longer be seen. The first confirmed contact came at 03:47 hours, February 12, 1983. The Arctic night hung heavy, its silence broken only by the distant churn of diesel engines beneath the ice. Inside Outpost 27-9, the men were half awake, half dreaming in the static hum of machines. Then the tone shifted, a low-frequency tremor that rolled across the consoles like the breath of something alive. On the main oscilloscope, a faint curvature appeared, a deviation of less than 0.07 degrees, but enough to ripple across every monitoring station. Atmospheric displacement, whispered Morozov. His hand hovered over the control board. Altitude 200 meters above sea level. Bearing northwest. No one responded. Every eye was locked on the glowing curve. Outside, snow fell without sound, coating the radar dish in pale ice. The Arctic wind carried the metallic groan of shifting steel. The hum rose another octave, then flattened steady. On the communications log, a single word blinked. Predictive echo confirmed. For 48 seconds, the signal hung in limbo. Then it split into three. NATO aircraft reconnaissance type, possibly American RF-4 Phantoms, were approaching low over the Norwegian Sea, their radar signatures invisible to conventional Soviet stations. But to Project Veil, they were already ghosts walking toward the border. Morozov gave the order, track and log. Do not engage. Observe the air itself. The operators began their sequence. Dials rotated, frequencies locked. Lines of numbers scrolled down, wax paper printouts, each one representing a ripple in the ionosphere. The predictive grid mapped the intruders like heat through fog. They were flying at speed, 140 knots, range 62 kilometers, altitude oscillating in rhythmic dips, terrain-hugging maneuvers designed to hide from radar. But the machine saw their wake, not their wings. Then came the radio burst. Command, this is North Sector Control. We've got interference across bands 6 to 9. Looks like. Static swallowed the voice. Another operator tried the line. Command confirm, channel link. We're receiving double-phase noise from... The lights flickered. The main frequency spike rose beyond expected amplitude. Every monitor in the bunker flashed white, then dimmed to green. For 6 seconds, no one could see. When the image returned, the three predicted trajectories had fused into a single streak, the radar's version of a heartbeat. The aircraft were no longer being detected as separate objects. They had entered what Morozov called the field of refraction. Continue logging, he said quietly. They'll feel it before they know it. Miles above the sea, NATO pilots flying near Bodo began reporting strange turbulence. Instruments wavered. Compasses spun. One crew described the air folding around them as if they had entered a transparent storm. Ground control in Norway received scrambled transmissions, distorted echoes of their own words returning seconds late. Within minutes, 2 aircraft aborted the run. The third pressed on toward Soviet airspace. At Outpost 27-9, the anomaly deepened. The radar's pulse synced perfectly with the aircraft's bearing. It was no longer predicting, it was shaping. Morozov leaned forward, his reflection fractured in the screen's glow. We are in full lock, he said. The sky is resonating. Then the instruments spiked again. Voltage surged past safety thresholds. Generators screamed, and every circuit breaker in the secondary hall snapped in unison. The entire outpost plunged into darkness, except for one emergency bulb pulsing red. The hum did not stop. It grew stronger, a low animal vibration in the bones of the building. Kill the output, shouted Lieutenant Plekhanov. We're feeding back into the array. No one moved. Morozov was staring at the display, still active despite the blackout. The radar continued transmitting autonomous. Data cascaded across the screen, pressure gradients, magnetic flux, something resembling coordinates, but shifted seconds ahead of time. It was predicting reality faster than it could unfold. Outside, the antenna array glowed faintly blue, haloed by ice. A sphere of ionized air shimmered above the dish, an aurora confined to a single point. It pulsed in rhythm with the radar's heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it began, the interference collapsed. The hum fell silent. Power returned in bursts. Screens flickered back to life. On the tracking grid, 2 NATO aircraft symbols blinked at the edge of the map, retreating. The third had vanished entirely. No one spoke. The data recorder continued to print a soft mechanical whisper against the walls. At timestamp 03:56:21, it logged the last entry: signal absorption complete. Echo not returned. The official Soviet report would later describe the event as localized atmospheric inversion. Unofficially, it was called the disappearance over Bodo. The recovered NATO logs confirmed that one aircraft, Phantom serial 680487, had vanished from radar while returning to base, its final radio transmission. Losing altitude. No response from controls. What is that noise? The wreckage was never found. In Moscow, the Defense Committee labeled it coincidence. In Murmansk, they called it proof. The machine had worked beyond expectation, but no one could explain how. Power fluctuations during the event exceeded design limits by 340%, yet the hardware survived intact. Energy output calculated after the fact suggested the radar had drawn atmospheric charge equivalent to 1.2 megawatts, more than enough to disrupt any analog avionics within a 50-mile radius. The following days were chaos. NATO scrambled to understand what had happened. AWACS surveillance detected electromagnetic interference spreading outward in concentric rings, weakening toward the pole. American analysts speculated about solar activity, but the pattern repeated same frequency, same origin, for 3 consecutive nights. Pilots began avoiding the corridor north of Tromsø altogether. In NATO records, the anomaly was listed as Event Echo 3, though none publicly linked it to Soviet operations. Inside Outpost 27-9. Exhaustion set in. The men slept in shifts of 3 hours, haunted by the rhythmic pulse that still vibrated faintly through the walls. Morozov spent his nights replaying data on endless loops. "We've crossed from prediction into participation," he murmured. "We are no longer observers." The terrain itself seemed to conspire with them. Ice plains stretched for miles, scattering radio signals in unpredictable ways. Mountains carved from ancient volcanic rock acted as natural amplifiers. Even the auroras above the green ribbons that once served as spectacle now responded faintly to the radar's bursts, twisting in sync with the transmissions. Scientists from Leningrad would later estimate that each atmospheric pulse from Outpost 27-9 propagated across a radius of 600 kilometers, overlapping NATO flight paths across the Barents Sea. As tensions rose, communication discipline tightened. Every transmission was now coded, every report duplicated by hand in case the machines betrayed them. The operators learned to trust their instincts over instruments. If the static sounded wrong, it usually meant it was right. The system's feedback loops grew more erratic, stronger with emotion, weaker when calm. It mirrored the crew itself, as though their own nerves were part of the circuit. On February 18th, NATO reconnaissance again approached the Soviet boundary, this time higher, faster, determined to provoke a measurable reaction. 3 aircraft supported by a naval destroyer below. Outpost 27-9 went to full readiness. Power levels climbed to maximum safe load. Predictive algorithms hummed. The radar dish aligned with mechanical precision. Contact at 71 degrees north, Plekhanov announced. Range 90 kilometers, speed 720 knots. Morozov nodded. Let the sky decide. The radar pulsed once, then again. The feedback loop stabilized, smooth and clear. This time, the interference field didn't blind NATO screens. Instead, it bent them. Pilots reported seeing double ghost versions of their own aircraft flickering on the horizon. Ground control readings split, tracking false duplicates diving into the sea. Confusion erupted. Missiles armed, then stood down. No one could tell what was real. For 11 minutes, the battle was fought entirely through static. No missiles launched, no bullets fired. Yet in that chaos, a new weapon was born, one that fought perception itself. At RO 409, the radar fell silent. The interference ceased. On the Soviet grid, the three NATO aircraft symbols merged into a single fading trace, then disappeared beyond range. The only message that came through the static was from a British pilot. We lost the sea. We lost everything. The next morning, frost coated every surface inside the bunker. The men worked in silence, documenting results, pretending the night had been ordinary. Morozov sat by the console, eyes hollow, fingers trembling over his notes. They thought we were blind, he said softly. But we were the storm. From that moment, the outpost ceased to be an experiment. Moscow reclassified Project Veil as an operational asset, codenamed Zarya 3. The Arctic became its theater. NATO flights retreated south, their confidence fractured. For the first time in the Cold War, superiority shifted without a single weapon fired. But among the crew of Outpost 27-9, victory carried a colder truth. The machine had proven capable of more than detection. It had rewritten the rules of engagement and perhaps reality itself. In their daily logs, one phrase began appearing in trembling handwriting. The radar sees before we exist, and deep beneath the Arctic ice in a chamber that never slept, the hum began again. Low, steady, endless, like a heartbeat that belonged to no one yet heard by all who dared to listen. The night the sky fractured began like any other, cold, silent, endless. February 21st, 1983. The Arctic wind pressed against the radar dome of Outpost 27-9 with the weight of an ocean. Inside, the men slept in fragments. The hum of the machine had become their second heartbeat, steady, patient, metallic. Then the pulse changed. A hesitation. 1 microsecond of silence between signals. Barely measurable, yet enough. Signal delay channel 3, said Plekhanov, voice tight. Morozov leaned over the console. Not a malfunction, he murmured. It's waiting. At 001:42, 3 contacts appeared fast high inbound. NATO strike aircraft confirmed by early warning posts in Murmansk. The first real incursion since Project Veil began. Moscow's order came through moments later: track, disrupt, deter. No kinetic response. Morozov exhaled slowly. We'll fight with silence. Power surged through the outpost. The radar dome glowed blue beneath the aurora frost, glimmering like veins of glass. Contact distance 70 kilometers, Plekhanov reported. The hum deepened into a slow heartbeat, sinking to something unseen. On the screen, waveforms twisted into a spiral, mathematically perfect, unnerving. What is that? Someone whispered. Morozov stared. It's them, he said. Or their reflection of us. Outside, air froze before it could carry sound. Inside, the rhythm tightened, thump, 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 like a machine sinking with its prey. Then the first aircraft crossed into range. Static detonated through the speakers. Breakers tripped, sparks burst, smoke filled the air. Stabilize output, shouted Plekhanov. Morozov slammed the manual override. The machine refused to stop. Its coil spun faster, beyond command, beyond safety. Let it run, he said through clenched teeth. It knows what to do. For 11 seconds, the radar acted alone. It recalculated resonance aligned phase by fractions of a second and cast a counterwave field 800 kilometers wide. From the sky, NATO pilots later described a white horizon polar dawn at midnight. Then came chaos. Control, we're reading echoes multiple. We're chasing our own signals. On their screens, every jet multiplied into 10 phantoms. Missiles locked onto illusions, contrails, twisting like ribbons through the dark. One fighter broke apart mid-turn. Another vanished from radar, entirely reappearing seconds later, plummeting into cloud. Cut power, Morozov shouted, but the feedback loop locked. The hum sharpened to a scream. The entire bunker shook. Bulbs burst overhead. Ozone filled the air. Shut it down, Plekhanov yelled, pulling the main switch. Nothing. Private Kirov sprinted toward the auxiliary panel, wrench in hand. He tore off the safety plate and jammed it into the disconnect. A blinding flash and silence. Smoke drifted across the control room. The only sound was the crackle of burning insulation. Kirov lay beside the panel hand, blackened eyes open but unseeing. His skin still smoked. The coil kept spinning on stored momentum like a dying heart refusing to stop. Outside, the aurora flared one last time, brighter than dawn, then folded into darkness. A faint transmission broke through the static. "This is Eagle Flight. Losing altitude. Controls unresponsive." Then another "we." "See them. Everywhere." After that, nothing. 2 aircraft vanished from NATO radar. No distress calls, no debris. Search teams combed the Norwegian Sea for 3 days. They found only silence. At Outpost 27-9, the atmosphere thickened. No one met another's eyes. Kirov was wrapped in canvas and buried behind the generator shed, no record, no prayer. The maintenance log read simply: "Manual override engaged. Operator offline." That night, Morozov wrote his report to Moscow, half confession, half plea. "The machine acts on intent, not instruction. I fear it now predicts us." He never sent it. The next morning, the paper was gone. Days blurred. Conversation shrank to gestures. Even the hum faded, appearing only when someone thought about it. They began to wonder if it still existed, or if it had moved inside their skulls. During a brief power restoration, a message appeared on the radar screen. No operator input. No source code trace. Repair complete. Signal continues. The room froze. Plekhanov whispered a prayer. Morozov only stared. "It's learning," he said softly. "It remembers." That night he made his final entry. Losses: 1 operator, 2 aircraft, 12 hours of blackout. Lesson: prediction demands a price. He left the pen beside the console and stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The sky burned green and white. The aurora rippled like torn fabric. The radar dish shimmered, scarred, smoking alive. He touched its edge. The metal was warm. The burn marks mirrored Kirov's wound. He realized the truth: the machine had fulfilled its purpose to sense before being seen. But it had also done something else. It had remembered who touched it. From the ridge above, Morozov looked toward the frozen sea. A faint hum drifted on the wind, pulsing in rhythm with his heart. He whispered what all of them now knew by instinct: the radar sees before we exist. At dawn, a helicopter arrived with sealed orders. Project Veil suspended technical instability and operator fatigue. The real reason was simpler fear. They cut the power lines. The machine went dark. For the first time in months, silence seemed absolute. Yet beneath the ice, something still echoed, heartbeat against heartbeat, 1 second ahead. No medals. No names. Outpost 27-9 vanished from Soviet records within the year. In 1991, a salvage team uncovered a single torn page from the repair log, edges fused by frost. 3 words remained clear: "Signal never ends." And somewhere in the Arctic dark, beneath layers of frozen sea and memory, the hum continued, steady, patient, eternal. The sound of a war that learned to breathe. Morning came without sunrise. The Arctic horizon remained a sheet of pale metal, the wind scraping against the bunker walls, as if the world itself was trying to erase what had happened. Outpost 27-9 was quiet, not peaceful, just hollow, like a stage after the actors have gone. Inside, the air smelled of burnt copper and oil. The machine, for once, slept. For the first time in months, the men heard themselves think. Every sound, the rustle of a jacket, the clatter of a wrench, seemed too loud, as though the radar had stolen part of their hearing along with their nerves. 3 operators were evacuated by helicopter that morning, officially for frost injuries. In truth, they couldn't stop shaking. One of them, a communications tech named Volkov, muttered the same sentence again and again as he was carried out. "It remembers me." The tally was grim. 1 dead Private Kirov burned by a surge no one could explain. 2 NATO aircraft lost without trace. 4 days of blackout across the northern listening stations. Power output during the incident had exceeded projected safety margins by 312%, but the system's core remained intact. The logbooks called it controlled failure. The men called it luck. Repairs began immediately. By day 2, the auxiliary generator was running again, coughing smoke into the frozen air. Wires were replaced, gauges recalibrated. circuits scraped clean with pocket knives. Each repair felt more like penance than maintenance. They worked not to resurrect the radar, but to make sense of what it had become. When a colonel from the Northern Fleet arrived to inspect the site, he found soldiers speaking to machines as if to each other. They addressed the console like a patient recovering from trauma. "Easy now," one operator said, adjusting the dial. "Steady line. Steady breath." The colonel wrote in his field report, "Crew discipline remains high. Spiritual cohesion questionable." Morozov, once the most articulate man in the room, spoke little. His face had aged 10 years in a week. When asked about the incident, he simply replied, "We saw first, and it saw us back." He refused to power up the radar again. Instead, he sat in the control room, repairing it piece by piece as if restoring a memory he wished to forget. By March, Moscow sent orders dismantle and archive. Officially, Project Veil was over. Unofficially, it was being studied elsewhere under new names and stricter secrecy. Teams arrived to extract the data cores, sealing them in lead containers marked meteorological equipment. Every notebook, every spool of tape was cataloged and burned. Only fragments of the repair log survived, short notes written in uneven script. Primary coil stable. Predictive delay. Operators show fatigue beyond measurable limits. Lesson: the machine reacts to expectation. The leadership lessons came late, carved out of guilt more than pride. Morozov noted that success without understanding is indistinguishable from disaster, that command must never confuse control with foresight. Plekhanov, in his final debriefing, added one line that outlasted the program. "We trusted the signal more than we trusted each other. That was our mistake." When the outpost was finally shut down, temperatures had dropped to -48. The final power reading showed 11.3 megawatts of residual charge trapped in the ground, cables energy that should have dissipated, but didn't. The decommission team measured faint electromagnetic pulses for 3 more nights before the readings fell silent. On the last evening, the aurora returned, faint but deliberate, curling above the horizon, like the slow exhale of something relieved. The men were flown back to Leningrad in shifts. At the airfield, no one spoke. Their uniforms were stripped of insignia, their files sealed. They were told never to discuss the project, even among themselves. Most obeyed. Those who didn't found their letters, intercepted their phones, monitored. Within a year, Morozov had resigned from the Defense Ministry. He moved south, took a teaching post, and never worked with radar again. Yet even silence leaves residue. In 1989, a Norwegian trawler crew recorded unexplained bursts of low-frequency radio noise north of Murmansk, 6 beats per minute, steady, repeating every hour. When scientists replayed it, they heard what one described as the faint rhythm of a mechanical pulse. The pattern matched the archived resonance signature of Outpost 27-9. For the men who once served there, life went on in fragments. Plekhanov became a civil engineer. Volkov never returned to work. He was last seen at a monastery outside Arkhangelsk, claiming he could still hear the hum under the snow. Every few years, another declassified memo surfaced: radar interference, compass failure, communication, echoes, all dismissed as atmospheric phenomena. But those who knew the pattern never stopped recognizing it. Looking back, the results defied military accounting. Losses: 1 man, 2 enemy aircraft, and the sanity of an entire crew. Gains: 12 seconds of predictive advantage, the smallest edge imaginable, yet enough to alter how both sides viewed the sky forever. NATO doubled its stealth funding within a year. The Soviets restructured their electronic warfare doctrine around the principle Morozov had proven: the faster you see, the sooner you vanish. In the end, history reduced Project Veil to a rumor, a Cold War ghost filed between failures too strange to repeat. But among the few who lived it, the memory persisted, quiet as breath. They spoke of the machine not as invention, but as revelation, that human perception itself could be weaponized, that war was no longer about destroying bodies, but bending awareness. Morozov wrote one final note before disappearing from public life. It was found years later inside a sealed envelope at the Leningrad Institute of Physics. The handwriting was unsteady, but the thought was precise. We built a mirror to watch the enemy. It showed us ourselves instead. That was the thesis he could never publish, the truth that mattered beyond the battlefield. Project Veil wasn't just about radar or prediction or control. It was about vision, the the dangerous human need to see what comes next, even when that vision consumes the seer. When the last member of the crew died, an archivist added a final line to the sealed file of Outpost 27-9, dated October 1992. Cause of failure none confirmed. Cause of creation fear. Outside, the polar wind still howled across the rusted antenna frames. And somewhere beneath the ice, too deep to reach and too faint to measure, a pulse continued one beat ahead of time. One line that resolved it all. Because in the end, the radar proved that seeing first was never the same as understanding what was seen. For decades, Outpost 27-9 remained buried beneath the ice, its existence reduced to rumor and redacted footnotes. Yet its echo rippled quietly through every military doctrine that followed. By the late 1980s, both NATO and the Soviet Union had rewritten their early warning manuals to include anticipatory signal mapping, the art of predicting motion before detection. In truth, it was Project Veil reborn under cleaner names. The incident shifted warfare's philosophy. Victory was no longer measured in missiles or men, but in milliseconds. Every command center sought faster sensors, smarter radars, algorithms that could forecast rather than react. When the Soviet Union collapsed, fragments of Veil's research leaked into Western defense circles disguised as academic studies on atmospheric physics. Within 10 years, predictive targeting and cognitive radar became staples of modern electronic warfare. The Ghost machine had achieved immortality not in glory, but in code. Yet its deeper legacy was psychological. Outpost 27-9 taught both sides that perception could be manipulated as easily as terrain. That lesson birthed a new kind of weapon disinformation. If a radar could make pilots doubt their own instruments, what could a rumor or an algorithm do to nations? The Cold War ended, but the age of invisible warfare had just begun. Today, engineers still cite Morozov's principle in conferences on autonomous detection, though his name is absent from the slides. Historians debate whether the events near Murmansk were science or superstition. The documents declassified in 2011 confirm only this: a prototype radar operated outside its parameters. NATO lost 2 aircraft, and every official involved denied knowledge afterward. The rest remains classified or conveniently lost beneath melted permafrost. Why it matters now is simple. The story of Project Veil reminds us that progress built on fear is never neutral. Technology conceived to predict can just as easily decide. The men of Outpost 27-9 thought they were building foresight. What they created was dependence, a belief that machines could think faster, feel earlier, know better. That belief defines the 21st century as much as it once defined the Cold War. So when you hear a pulse in static or see light flicker before the storm, remember the radar that saw first and ask what price we pay for knowing too soon. If you've followed this far, subscribe for archival-based stories drawn from real declassified evidence, not sensational myths. Every document leaves a trace, and sometimes the truth hums just beneath the noise.